Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you're able to come this afternoon. I'm Sandy. I'm one of the deacons here at the church. And we're going to begin our afternoon with our dear Pastor Michelle saying grace for us all, please.
A little after the fact, but still appreciated. God of all, thank you for the many hands who made the soups that fed us today, as well as the wonderful desserts and bread. We are grateful most of all for your providing this time for us to be together and to know that you are God of the past, present, and future, and we're going to move into the past a little bit today. So thank you for this time to be together. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Michelle. So I'm just going to begin with a little introduction of Tracy Messer. And if I move around, George, that's totally going to mess you up, isn't it?
No.
Oh, you got a wide eye in the lens. Okay. All right, so here's our introduction of Tracy Messer. In the spring of 2017, living history performer Tracy Messer made his first appearance as Calvin Coolidge. Perhaps the question people ask most often is, why did you choose to become the next 30th President of the United States? He'll answer with a smile, I was born to play this role. Tracy was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area where his maternal grandfather worked for the United States Department of Agriculture, starting with the Coolidge administration. When his mother was a little girl, she joined in the annual Easter celebrations on the White House lawn where President and Mrs. Coolidge welcomed the children. Meanwhile, his father was born in Boston right about the time Calvin Coolidge was about to become governor of the state of Massachusetts. In fact, Tracy's great-grandfather once lived in the Coolidge's hometown of Northampton, Massachusetts. Tracy was not the first person to portray Calvin Coolidge. His friend and mentor, Jim Cook, has kept President Coolidge's memory alive and well for 30 years until his retirement in 2015. With encouragement from Jim, the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, and the Coolidge family, Tracy was honored by the invitation to become the next 30th President of the United States. When asked if he was ready for the job, he replied in the words of Calvin Coolidge, I think I can take a swing at it. Now that you know a little bit about Tracy, I welcome the 30th President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge.
In a quaint New England farmhouse on an early summer's day, a farmer's boy became our chief in a homely, simple way. With neither pomp nor pageantry, he firmly met the task. To keep him on that job of his is all the people ask. So keep cool and keep Coolidge is the slogan of today. Keep cool and keep Coolidge for the good old USA. A lot of politicians cannot do a thing but knock. But Calvin Coolidge is a man of action and not talk. So just keep cool and keep Coolidge in the White House 4 years more. We have a chance to do it in this year of 24. He's been tried, he's never wanting. He is giving of his best. Keep cool and keep Coolidge is our country's mighty test. With a private life of virtue and a public record clean, he stands upon the summit with a countenance serene. Defender of the righteous and a juggernaut to wrong, we'll make him stay in Washington 100 million strong. So keep cool and keep Coolidge is the slogan of today. Keep cool and keep Coolidge for the good old USA. A lot of politicians cannot do a thing but knock. But Calvin Coolidge is a man of action and not talk. So just keep cool and keep Coolidge in the White House 4 years more. We have a chance to do it in this year of 24. He's been tried, he's never wanting. He is giving of his best. Keep cool and and keep Coolidge is our country's mighty test.
Well, good afternoon. It was 100 years ago that a Vermonter became the 30th President of the United States upon the sudden death of Warren G. Harding. Calvin Coolidge was here in Vermont visiting his family's homestead in Plymouth when he learned the news and was sworn into office by his father under his authority as a notary public. Mr. Coolidge has a reputation of being a man of few words. His wife, Grace Goodhue Coolidge, recounted that a young woman sitting next to Coolidge at a dinner party confided to him that she had a bet that she could get more than just 2 words of conversation from him. With a straight face, he quietly retorted, "You lose." Yet a man who was remembered for what he didn't say or do, Silent Cal, actually said and did a lot. You may be surprised to learn that. During his 6 years in the White House, Calvin Coolidge gave more in-person press conferences than any American president before or since. He was a master of modern-day communications. Calvin Coolidge was the first president to consistently use radio to address the American people. He had a passion for languages, including English, Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. A foreign diplomat once said that Mr. Coolidge could be silent in 5 languages. In a recent biography, simply titled Coolidge, author Amity Shalais highlights some of the remarkable achievements Americans enjoyed from the Coolidge prosperity associated with the Roaring Twenties. And as we're into the 20s now, 100 years later, let's reflect. The federal budget was always in surplus, and the national debt significantly reduced. Taxes were reduced considerably, with the top rate coming down from over 70% to 25%. By 1927, 98% of the population paid no federal income tax. Unemployment was as low as 3%. Americans in the 1920s had their homes electrified, got indoor plumbing, bought automobiles, and thanks to productivity gains, had their standard work week shortened to 5 days rather than 6. Perhaps as important as his policy record is his personal record of leadership with dignity and humility. Reflecting on his decision not to seek re-election in 1928, President Coolidge wrote, "It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know that he is not a great man." I'll just leave it at that. Please join me in welcoming our 30th President of the United States, a good man, Calvin Coolidge.
Thank you for your kind introduction. It is good to be back here in Ludlow, and as I look out amongst the audience, I know that this afternoon I am not only among friends, I'm among family. And I thank you very much for that. I bring you greetings from First Congregational Church in Washington, D.C., Edwards Church in my hometown of Northampton, Massachusetts, and from Union Christian Church in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, where I was born on the 4th of July, 1872. Now, I must confess that as a boy, I did not always attend church regularly. But then again, neither did the preachers. attendance in rural churches varied as upon the weather and the availability of the clergy. As the story goes, there was once a young preacher who traveled from town to town and arrived in church one morning to find just one man in attendance. The preacher asked the man if, under the circumstances, he would like for him to proceed with the service. The man replied, "Well, Reverend, I'm just an old Vermont farmer, but it seems to me that if I go out to feed the cattle a load of hay and only one cow shows up, I still feed her." The preacher took the hint and proceeded with the service in its entirety. Afterwards, he asked the man what he thought. "Well, Reverend, I'm just an old Vermont farmer, but it seems to me that if I go out and feed the cattle and only one cattle shows up, I don't feed her the whole darn load." Politicians, like preachers, occasionally need to be reminded about the importance of brevity. In my second inaugural address as president of the Massachusetts Senate, I concluded my remarks with this advice: "And be brief. Above all things, be brief." In that spirit, I'd like to say a few words about 5 values that are near and dear to me: love of God, of country, of family, of fellow man, and of home. First and foremost is a love of God. Without the sustaining influence of a faith in a divine power, we could have little faith in ourselves. We need to feel that behind us is intelligence and love. Doubters do not achieve. Skeptics do not contribute. Cynics do not create. Faith is the great motive power, and no man reaches his full possibilities unless he has a deep conviction that life is eternally important, and that work, well done, is part of an unending plan. These were the words that I expressed to a delegation of Boy Scouts on July 25th, 1924. The second value is a love of country. Patriotism is easy to understand. It means looking out for yourself by looking out for your country. Now, pride in one's nation should not be confused with elitism. Whether one traces his Americanism back 3 centuries to the Mayflower or 3 years to the steerage is not half so important as one's Americanism of today, if it is real and genuine. No matter by what various crafts we all came here, we are now all in the same boat. My third value is love of family. The influence of my parents is inestimable. It seems impossible that any man could adequately describe his mother. I cannot mine. She was practically an invalid ever after I could remember her, but she used what strength she had in lavishing her care upon me and my younger sister Abby, who was a member of this very congregation. When our mother knew that her end was near, she called us children to her bedside, where we knelt down to receive her final pattern blessing. In an hour, she was gone. It was her 39th birthday. I was 12 years old. We laid her away in the blustering snows of March. The greatest grief that can come to a boy came to me. Life was never to be the same again. My father, Colonel John Coolidge, was a man of many talents. When news of President Haddon's death reached me in the middle of the night at my boyhood home on August 3rd, 1923, it was my father who administered the presidential oath of office in his capacity as a notary public. When asked later why he presumed to have the authority to do so, my father replied, "Nobody told me I couldn't." I met my wife, Grace Anna Goodhue, while she was a teacher at the Clark School for the Deaf in Northampton, Massachusetts. A man who has the companionship of a lovely and gracious woman enjoys the supreme blessing that life can give. And no citizen of the United States knows the truth of that statement more than I. We thought we were made for each other. For almost a quarter of a century, she has borne with my infirmities, and I have rejoiced in her graces. We were blessed with two sons, John and Calvin Jr. Growing up, they gained an appreciation for thrift and the dignity of hard work. When other boys were astonished to see the son of a president working in the tobacco fields, one of them remarked to Calvin Jr. that, "If my father were president, I wouldn't be working here." To which my boy replied, "If your father were my father, you would." As you may know, Calvin Jr.'s life was cut short at the age of 16. He had developed an infection from a blister on his toe after playing tennis on the White House lawn. When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. My eldest son, John, married Miss Florence Trumbull, daughter of the governor of Connecticut. Any descendants I now have come through their union. My fourth value that I'd like to share with you is a love of fellow man. I'm very mindful that whatever successes I have enjoyed throughout my lifetime are due to the people who helped me along the way. On my very first day in the White House, I sat down at my desk at 6:30 in the morning to write my first official communication as President of the United States. The letter was not addressed to a politician nor a head of state. It was written to Mr. James Lucy, a cobbler from my hometown of Northampton, Massachusetts, who had befriended me as a student at Amherst College and since became an old friend with a Yankee philosopher's bent. The 3 sentences in my letter expressed my gratitude and my affection. My dear Mr. Lucy, not often do I see you or write to you, but I want you to know that if it were not for you, I would not be here. And I want to tell you how much I love you. Don't work too hard and try to enjoy yourself. Yours sincerely, Calvin Coolidge. The last value I'd like to share with you this afternoon today is a love of home. If you want to experience a little bit of heaven on earth, I invite you to visit my birthplace at Plymouth Notch. In the fall of 1928, I toured my native state to assess the recovery from a devastating flood that took place the previous year. It was this experience that inspired me to compose the following tribute. Vermont is a state I love. I could not look upon the peaks of Ascutney, Killington, Mansfield, or Equinox without being moved in a way that no other scene could move me. It was here that I first saw the light of day. I received my bride. Here, my dead lie pillowed on the everlasting breast of our eternal hills. I love Vermont because of her hills and valleys, her scenery, and invigorating climate. But most of all, because of her indomitable people. They are a race of pioneers who have almost begged themselves to serve others. If the spirit of liberty should vanish in other parts of the nation and support for our institutions should languish, it could all be replenished by the generous store held by the people of this brave little state of Vermont. Thank you. Good questions. Yes, sir.
There's a story about grizzly bears on the White House lawn. Can you tell us about that? And what was your thinking behind it?
Grizzly bears on the White House lawn. Well, Mrs. Coolidge and I had a great affection for animals of all kinds. We had dogs, we had cats, we had canaries. We were given a pet raccoon who was intended to be the guest of honor for Thanksgiving in 1926 until she got a presidential pardon, and then Rebecca became a household pet. And it seemed to catch on that other individuals would present us with other gifts. We had the grizzly bears that were presented from Mexico. We had a pygmy hippopotamus that was a gift from Harvey Firestone of the Firestone Tire Company. And eventually they all found their way into the National Zoo. But the Coolidge household was filled with pets and a lot of joy at that as well. Yes?
I've heard a story about you over the years. You came home to your home in Plymouth, and you apparently brought your photographer along with you. And you came out of the house one day. They were mowing the fields and haying or whatever, and you came out with your duster on, and you got up on the machine or whatever they were using, and got the reins for the horses, and the photographer took your picture. You got off, went back into the house, and the next thing you know, down in the Boston paper was an article saying that Cal was home helping hay. And all you did was get on the wagon and get right off just for a picture.
Yes.
That was told by my father-in-law because apparently he was there and saw
Yes, indeed. It is interesting the things that one has to do to cultivate a relationship with the media. Now, the story of the haying, well, that is something as a boy growing up on the farm I did every year. And it was my custom to wear an old smock that had belonged to my grandfather, and I think it belonged to his father as well. It was a very durable yet breathable fabric that was good for working out in the haying. And I had a floppy hat to keep the sun out of my eyes, and I would swing aside with the best of them. But somehow the media thought that was artificial, that I was dressing up in some sort of a costume, and it couldn't at all be real. So I decided, well, I'd put on my coat and tie and get out there on the tractor and start to run the sickle bar. Well, they seemed to swallow that one. I got another dose of that when I was out in South Dakota for the dedication of Mount Rushmore, when some of the local Boy Scouts presented me with some dress clothes, 10-gallon hat and some chaps. Well, it was a gift to the president, and I thought they gave them to me because they wanted to put them on, so I did. The media's had a field day with that as well. When I was also out in the Dakotas, I was also named an honorary Indian chief by the local Sioux tribe. I wore the headdress, and I was incredibly honored by that because we believe in our Coolidge family heritage that through the Thomson side of the family, there is traces of Native American blood. And I'm proud to say that it was during the Coolidge administration that we passed the Native American Act. Prior to that, Native Americans were officially not citizens of the United States. And as they came back from serving during the First World War, I felt it was an injustice for them not to enjoy the benefits that they had worked so hard to fight for and protect. The Indian American Act changed that at the time. Yes?
Can you put your hat on?
Can I put my hat on? I think that these just might come back in style. These are known as boater hats, and it was really in Venice that they became quite popular amongst the gondoliers, although this does not have a ribbon down the back as they might have had. But these became quite fashionable in, I'd say, the 1890s. We were wearing them when I was in college at Amherst College, and you still saw them going into the days of World War I. But after that, they seem to have fallen out of fashion.
So, is there a story behind why you wore it all the time? At least I remember all the pictures, Mr. President, of you wearing them.
This is a seasonal hat.
Okay.
So technically, the tan suit and the boater hat would be worn during the spring and summer and maybe late into the fall. But typically during a winter, I would be wearing a black pinstripe suit with a black fedora hat. We have to observe these sartorial niceties. Thank you for asking. Yes?
Could you give us a few scintillating tidbits of your life as a student in this town, the Black River Academy?
Oh, yes. Well, the Black River Academy is very near and dear to my heart. My parents and my grandmother had actually attended the Black River Academy. Now, that was the old building that had been taken down in 1888. And the one that you see today there was built while I was a student there. So we've had multiple generations of Coolidges that have attended the Black River Academy. Now, there was no dormitory up there. It was customary for students and teachers to take up residence with local families in boarding houses. And perhaps maybe later this spring or summer, we might go on a walking tour, and I can show you the 4 houses on Pleasant Street where I had stayed as a boy, and 2 of them that are still up there on Main Street. It was typically customary that you'd switch out from one house to the next. You don't want to wear out your welcome too much. But it was also a chance to switch out with different friends and classmates there who'd be your roommates. But one story that was often told was the custodian came to the building one morning to light the fire, and he heard a racket going up on that third floor. He went up there, and to his astonishment, there was tied up into the classroom a donkey. And if you think the custodian was mad, you should have seen the donkey. Well, an investigation went out as to how mysteriously that donkey got up onto the third floor. It made the local papers, and there were not too many trustees that were happy about this instance. But I mention in my autobiography that the fact that I was not convicted of the crime, one must therefore presume I was innocent. Yes, ma'am.
What would you tell the presidents that are coming along now for advice? What kind of advice would you like to give them if you could do that?
Well, that would be presumptuous on my part, but I can say that I drew a lot of advice from my predecessors. Mr. Lincoln was my personal favorite president, and his wisdom is something that carried down to the ages that I trust advises the incumbents of the White House from then to now moving forward. So I would encourage any student of history to learn about our founding fathers and learn about the principles that underlie our government. Because if you don't understand the inspiration of the Declaration of Independence and understand that it is a document founded in faith, then you don't understand democracy. So I hope that perhaps some of my successors would find some inspirations in my words. My speeches were published in 3 different books. Have Faith in Massachusetts was the epimonious speech that I had given as governor of Massachusetts. Then The Price of Freedom and The Foundations of the Republic. So the words are there that I hope will find their ways to a new generation and give them a sense of inspiration. Thank you for asking that. Yes, ma'am.
There was an earthquake in Japan that you had played a role in getting aid to them. Can you speak to that?
Disasters are part of the inevitable occurrence of things that you have to deal with when you're in the White House. Nobody can foresee these coming. They can be man-made, they can be natural. We had our share, as you had heard, in Vermont with the 1927 floods and the Mississippi floods that preceded that. But it was in 1923 when a disastrous earthquake hit Japan, losing more than 100,000 lives. And at that point, we had no emergency funding for dealing with disasters domestically, let alone internationally. However, as President of the United States, I took it upon myself to be the head of the American Red Cross. And I put an appeal in the local syndicated papers that raised some $11 million from American citizens to support the charity and the humanitarian relief in Japan. And if I may defer to my colleague, Mr. Messer, he can tell you a little bit more about what came after that. I'm so glad you asked this question. Because it was perhaps 2 Sundays ago that I had a chance to bring a special visitor here, a visiting professor from Japan. And he was in the process this very month of holding a conference on disaster management and planning. And Governor Jim Douglas, former governor of Vermont and trustee of the Coolidge Foundation, is over in Japan right now because the people of Japan have not forgotten the generosity of the American citizens at the time of that disaster 100 years ago. And they're creating a humanitarian award, and the very first recipient of that reward posthumously will be Calvin Coolidge. It's amazing to think in a state where not many people remember Calvin Coolidge in his own native state, that the people of Japan remembered that act of kindness and generosity led by the president on behalf of the American citizens. And in his speech to the American Red Cross, Mr. Coolidge says that amongst his most cherished possessions in his personal library is a set of volumes, bound volumes of letters from school children in Japan after the earthquake, thanking President Coolidge and the American people for their generosity. And to me, it kind of sends chills up my spine, because that's, to me, what diplomacy is all about. Thank you for that. Appreciate the question. Yes, sir. My good friend Steve Wood. Mr. Lincoln is here.
Alluding to your comment about the importance of brevity in matters of communication, at least. I'm wondering if you haven't already. I did come in a bit late, but it was just before you began your presentation, so I don't think I missed it. But your response to a reporter, I think it was, who had been challenged to get you to give a lengthy discourse, and what your response to that was. That he or she, I don't know the gender of the individual, but had been challenged to get you to say more than 2 words. And what your response to that was.
I'm glad you asked that question, because up until last week, I did not have an answer to that question. We alluded to that in the introduction here, and right now I'm going to speak as Tracy here, because this is a little bit of the space-time continuum shift. The story of You Lose is the first story that somebody will say when they come up and interact with me as Calvin Coolidge. Silent Cal, you lose. Beyond that, they really don't know much else.
As I just demonstrated.
So, I wanted to find out, since this has become an iconic story, what is the genesis of that story? And thanks to being able to use newspapers.com and drilling down and finding these nuggets of gold that are there, the answer was in the New York Times, just waiting for me to find it. It was on April 22nd, 1924, President Coolidge was invited to give an address before the Associated Press. This was at the Waldorf Astoria, the original Waldorf Astoria that was torn down in 1929. Pass this around. Beautiful old building, the original Waldorf Astoria. It was torn down to make way for a new building. Any guesses as to what that new building is?
Boston Waldorf?
No.
Empire State Building.
The Empire State Building. That was built on the site of the Waldorf Astoria, where on the 22nd of April, 1924, Calvin Coolidge gave an address before the Associated Press. And he was introduced by Frank B. Noyes, who was the president of the Associated Press. And this is from the New York Times. During his introduction to the speech, Mr. Noyes had some gentle fun and expense of President Coolidge's reputation for taciturny. He told the story, which he had said had been current in Washington last year, 1923, of a very certain, very high official who nobody had any difficulty identifying as the president. According to Mr. Noyes, this official at dinner one night sat next to a lady who told him that he had the power to win or lose a wager for her, that no matter how reserved he might be with others, he would talk to her. "You lose," was the only answer attributed by Mr. Noyes to this high official. "Your president has given you a perfect example," said Mr. Coolidge, "of one of those rumors now in Washington which is without any foundation." The audience laughed, and then Mr. Coolidge went ahead with his prepared speech. Now, as you look at the genesis of this particular story, it gets funnier when it's retold, because simply to make a wager that she could get him to talk is not nearly as funny as you set the joke up and say, "I made a bet that I could get you to say more than 2 words. You lose." So, as it has been retold, they've refined the joke that it got funnier. But I was also curious to find out what was the very first incident of that story being published, since in that introduction, it was already a well-known story that was told in Washington, D.C. The reason that it really became iconic is because the speech and the remarks were given to the Associated Press, and the speech was broadcast on radio. So the story was published in every newspaper across the country, and Americans all across the country heard it on the radio for themselves. So that's why it became the iconic story. But only a few months earlier, there was what I found was the original published account of this story. And this is how it reads. "Coolidge will pep up Congress with dinners," Sun headline. The columnist, Sophie Irene Loeb, goes on to say, "He may try, but they say that our president has a positive gift for de-pepping the dinner table. When he was VP, 2 Washington women who had served and suffered as his partners laid a little bet. 'Oh, Mr. Coolidge,' cooed the one Cal took in that night, 'I have a wager with Mrs. Jones that you will talk to me.' 'Madam,' the Sphinx replied as he unfolded his napkin, 'you lose.'" And what I found absolutely fascinating in trying to figure out who was this columnist, Sophie Irene Loeb, who's credited for first publishing this story. She has a remarkable story in and of herself. She was a Jewish immigrant born in the Ukraine, came over to New York City, married, divorced, and she rose to become the only woman at the time who was a department of the New York City government. She headed the Child Welfare Bureau, and a lot of the momentum that was to improve the child labor laws were from this relationship between Sophie Irene Loeb, and she had a personal correspondence with Calvin Coolidge. So they had a very cordial relationship, so when she was poking fun at him, she was poking fun at a friend. Well, you all have been very gracious with your time. I'm going to be around for a little while if others have some questions. I've got some t-shirts over there. Pick a color and a size that you like. If you don't find a color and a size you like, take one anyway and give it to somebody else.